Black studies really helps with the transformation of the general intellectual enterprise, right? It's a challenge to this idea of a value-free social science. It's a challenge to this intellectual enterprise that was built around the presumed inferiority of Black people and Blackness. So it does that by studying, by creating a discipline, by studying the Black experience. It transforms this intellectual enterprise and opens up the space. It transforms the way we produce knowledge about Black peoples when we have knowledge that's coming directly from the experiences of Black people, as opposed to knowledge that's created about Black people based on presumed biases, right? So today's lecture, we're going to talk about the institution of slavery, and in particular the plantation complex. We've talked about the transatlantic slave trade, right, as a global political and economic system and the rise of capitalism. But we actually haven't really talked about the structures and features of the institution of slavery. And so what I want to do today is really talk about that, but also talk about it in the context that is more hemispheric, right, in the sense of thinking about slavery as something that did not just occur in the U.S., but occurred throughout the Western Hemisphere. So we'll talk about comparisons between the U.S. and the Caribbean and sometimes Latin America. So how did U.S. and other diaspora communities respond to this onslaught of social, economic, political, and representational oppression? Well, they had diverse strategies. And so what I'm going to focus on now are the various cultural and political responses to this context, right, this political economic context of repression. There were diverse strategies of the Black community. They participated in electoral politics when possible. They formed various forms of protest through print media. They had conventions, etc. There was also a group that had armed self-defense, especially against the racial violence of the KKK and mobs, riot mobs in the South and in the Midwest. At the same time, many in that community turned inward and really focused on strengthening the bonds of communities.
The materials that you just listened to and viewed, what we see is that following slavery, emancipation, and Reconstruction, there's this massive migration of Black people from the rural South to urban areas of the South and urban North of the United States. And that has serious consequences for many of America's major cities, including places like Chicago, St. Louis, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Atlanta, Memphis, and Philadelphia.
And the narrative is such, at least in mainstream historical narratives, that things have just gotten better for Blacks ever since then. Freed in 1865, and then on to radical Reconstruction, and then on to a rather difficult period of time that necessitated the rise of the civil rights movement and the urgency of implementing the enforcement of constitutional amendments that had been created in the 19th century. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Black Power movement, electoral politics getting better and better for Black people as time goes on in the 1970s. All of this to say is that there's this idea that if Blacks start here in 1865, that things just go up for them, which culminates in the presidency of Barack Obama. But this is a problem for us as historians, and it's a problem for us as everyday people when we think about where we are today.
So the question that we're going to focus on today, and the question I've been addressing in my own research, is how to explain the pervasive and the persistent failure of Black children in American schools. And most importantly, what can we do to use education as a means to expand opportunity and to change outcomes for Black children? This, to me, is the critical question, because schools aren't supposed to be the starting point for a life in prison. Schools are supposed to be the starting point for a life of opportunity. And the question is, how do we make sure those opportunities are available to Black children as we would hope they're available for all children throughout American society?
Similarly, in the resistance of the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, during the era of the Movement for Black Lives, which is founded by 3 Black women, they wrote a statement about the Dakota Access Pipeline stating, "There's no Black liberation without indigenous sovereignty." Now, this is a crucial point and one of the first times that this has happened in modern memory, where Black people are explicitly saying that they're standing in solidarity with indigenous peoples. And this is also shown up through hip-hop in particular. Now, I'm going to play this video, but just hip-hop, for me, is one way in which Black and Native people have coalesced and will continue to coalesce, demonstrating what my colleague here at UCLA, Shauna Redmond, would call an anthem, where music and videos are used to challenge settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, but they're using this Black culture and art form to do so.
So these national anthems, as we commonly think of them, are similarly conceived as mechanisms by which people are organized. You might think of the Star-Spangled Banner, for example, in the United States, that this song is similarly meant to organize all of its citizenry around a certain set of shared ideas and practices that we know to stand, we know to place our hand over heart, all things that have in the contemporary moment been challenged, and rightly so.
I'm going to take us back to Alabama and examine the role of Black women voters in the 2017 election of Democrat Doug Jones. During this Alabama Senate race, we see here the final election results, once disaggregated by race and gender, show that white men voted for Roy Moore at 74%, white women at 65%. On the other hand, Black men voted for the Democratic candidate Doug Jones at 92%, and African-American women at 97%.
And so it's important to know the cultural roots, the historical roots of this Black cultural difference, because we need to recognize what Black people are, who Black people are, the Black cultural difference, not as inferior, but as a product of specific historical experiences that are lived through identities of race, gender, class, and sexuality. And it also really helps us to approach our human differences, like Audre Lorde says, not with fear, loathing, and ignorance, but as equals, right? To think about how people's historical experiences impact their cultural practices, and to see cultural practices that are different from ours, not as inferior, but as a different set of practices.